They once burned brilliantly under the stage lights. But when the velvet curtain finally fell, the truth that remained was more terrifying than any song they ever sang. Chilling autopsy reports slowly stripped away the halo of fame, exposing the raw reality behind the deaths of R&B legends, where the spotlight of glory faded into darkness, where shocking secrets were sealed in pain and tears. Prince, the immortal symbol, departed in an agony no one saw coming. Whitney Houston, the voice of an angel, collapsed in a tragedy that left the world stunned. And there is still more, lying silent within seemingly dry medical records. Revelations so disturbing that few dared to believe them. 10 autopsy secrets from R&B icons that will send shivers down your spine, make your heart race, and force you to wonder, is the light of fame simply too high a price to pay? Before we step into this shadowed realm and uncover each shocking secret, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the truths that have been buried for so many years. Some nights, the music feels like it never really leaves. It hangs in the air above empty stages and follows the name Prince into places no spotlight ever reached. Down sterile hallways, into quiet rooms, beneath fluorescent lights that do not applaud. When the toxicology findings became public, the reaction wasn't loud at first. It was the kind of silence that spreads when numbers land with the weight of certainty. The fentanyl concentrations cited, figures measured in micrograms, delivered with clinical precision, were so extreme that even experienced physicians reportedly paused before speaking. For most bodies, thresholds like that are not warnings, they are endings. And for a man whose rhythm once moved entire arenas, those cold measurements struck like a hard correction to a comforting myth that fame can insulate a life from harm. The most haunting part wasn't simply that medication was involved. It was the sense of how easily it could happen in plain sight, how an artist surrounded by professionals, schedules, and safeguards could still slip through unseen. The way a small fracture spreads behind a polished wall. Recollections from the people around him, family, staff, clinicians, have been described as fragments that never quite locked together. They circle the same question. How could someone so uncompromising about control in the studio lose control over what was entering his bloodstream? Prince had built a reputation on resistance. He battled industry power, refused deals he believed compromised him, and fought to own his sound. Yet the story of his final days suggests a different kind of struggle, one not against a label, but against pain, fatigue, and the quiet logic of quick relief. For many who admired him, that irony hurt almost as much as the loss itself. For Black audiences in particular, Prince was more than a star. He was proof that boundaries could be crossed and remade. That's why the role of pharmaceuticals, tools the healthcare system is meant to manage responsibly, felt like a bitter betrayal. His death did not read as a private tragedy alone. It echoed a broader pattern in the lives of touring artists. Relentless travel, constant performance, contracts that demand endurance, and public images that leave no room for weakness. When bodies begin to fail, solutions arrive in small bottles. Not every prescription is wrong, but too often, the fastest option becomes the most dangerous one. Stories have long circulated about chronic hip pain, an injury worsened by the physical intensity that made his shows legendary. Some accounts suggest he tried to change course, switching doctors, adjusting treatment, attempting to stop certain medications. In the end, certainty is scarce and rumor is plentiful. What remains vivid is the picture of a performer who could step into the light with a flawless grin while carrying private evidence of how much it hurt to keep going. After the report surfaced, people began combing through the timeline like investigators of grief, looking at prescriptions, piecing together conversations, replaying moments when he vanished from public view. Many wanted a single mistake to blame, a clean narrative, a one-time miscalculation, but the details refused to stay that simple. What emerged looked less like an isolated incident and more like a reflection of a brutal ecosystem, one where artists are expected to be invincible, where exhaustion is treated as inconvenience, and where falling apart is not allowed. Prince is gone, yet the stark language of that medical record still reverberates, an unsettling reminder that sometimes what threatens the music isn't the silence after a final note, but the quiet normalcy of prescriptions no one stops to question. The music hadn't stopped yet. Smoke still curled through the room, and on a nearby table sat a scatter of prescription bottles, labels that would have made any physician pause. Rick James was never a subtle presence. He lived at full volume, loved without restraint, and chased excess as if moderation had never been invented. But when the autopsy findings became public, the revelation stunned even those who thought they knew his chaos. His bloodstream carried traces of alprazolam, diazepam, bupropion, citalopram, hydrocodone, digoxin, chlorpheniramine, alongside methamphetamine and cocaine, a list so extensive it seemed impossible that one body could hold it all, let alone the same body that once shook dance floors across the 1980s. What unsettled people most was not any single substance. The report made one thing clear: none of them, on their own, reached a level deemed immediately fatal. There was no singular blow, no dramatic overdose in isolation. Instead, it was a collision, a tangled composition where each element might have passed unnoticed alone, but together formed a crushing weight on a heart already worn thin. By that time, Rick James was battling multiple chronic conditions, cardiac problems, respiratory issues, and the resilience that once defined him had quietly eroded. For fans, especially those who had embraced him as the embodiment of fearless rebellion, the story suddenly felt exposed and uncomfortably real. The late-night parties, the carefree television appearances, the swagger, it all looked different when viewed under the unforgiving light of a medical examiner's report. People close to him had long mentioned that he carried pills not merely for indulgence, but to cope with the relentless physical toll of decades on stage. Yet, where exactly does relief end and dependency begin? That line, once crossed, rarely announces itself. The autopsy did not pass judgment. What it did was reveal an industry truth many preferred not to confront. Pills had become part of the routine. Early flights followed by midnight performances. Medication to sleep, medication to wake, something to dull pain, something else to lift the mood. Rick James was not alone in this cycle, but his case stood out for the sheer number of substances listed, names typed coldly on a page. Stripped of rhythm, stripped of funk, stripped of the fire that once defined him. Grief among fans quickly mixed with anger, anger that a legend's body had become a testing ground, anger that no one stepped in sooner to ask whether all of it was truly necessary, anger at an industry that celebrated his explosions under stage lights, yet stayed silent in the quiet rooms backstage. He sang openly about excess and pleasure, but the cost he paid wasn't confined to medical charts. It showed in the stunned faces of those who believed he would keep dancing forever. When the report surfaced, it didn't bring closure. It brought heavier questions. Responsibility was impossible to assign cleanly, and perhaps no single person held enough power to stop what was already in motion. What remained was an image burned into memory: a man with a wild afro, gripping a microphone, electrifying the crowd, while, beyond the neon glow, an unseen storm of medications slowly wore down the heart of the man the world knew as Super Freak. The bathroom was bathed in a dim yellow light. The door stood half open, and the lingering scent of water mixed with cleaning chemicals still clung to the air. When hotel staff stepped inside, the moment froze into an image many would later avoid discussing, yet could never erase from memory. Whitney Houston, the radiant voice that once moved the entire world, lay there, surrounded by fragments of a life that had once burned brilliantly. Nearby sat a spoon dusted with a faint trace of white powder, a crumpled piece of paper as though just discarded, a half-finished bottle of champagne beside a can of beer, several Xanax and Flexeril pills scattered across the surface, and even a set of dentures, an intimate detail few people knew she carried after years of relentless strain. What made the room so devastating was not merely the inventory recorded in the autopsy, but the small abrasions on her forehead and nose, minor marks, experts said, consistent with light impacts and showing no signs of struggle. Still, to the public, each scratch felt like an unanswered question, a silent suggestion that something had unfolded before the final moment. A voice that immortalized "I will always love you" now rested amid alcohol, pills, and powder, details that sent a chill through anyone who read them. Those close to her spoke of years spent fighting exhaustion and emotional pressure, endless tours, A turbulent personal life and constant pursuit by flashing cameras had left her searching for ways to endure. Legally, many of the medications had prescriptions, but taken together, they transformed that hotel bathroom into a far more dangerous place than any stage she had ever commanded. The autopsy ruled out foul play. There was no intruder, no violent confrontation, no hidden plot to support the conspiracy theories that quickly circulated. Yet the findings offered little comfort. What remained was the image of a global icon alone in a room heavy with the smell of alcohol and medicine, her lungs showing early emphysema from years of smoking, and the smile that once captivated millions now preserved only in photographs. Fans grieved not only the loss of a legend, but the loneliness laid bare in that space. Every object spoke of quiet self-soothing, a drink to calm the nerves, a pill to invite sleep, a small escape from overwhelming pressure. There was no dramatic chaos, only stillness, and that stillness cut deeper, because even surrounded by fame and applause, Whitney Houston ultimately faced her struggle alone. When the report was released, it read like a sterile list: Xanax, Flexeril, cocaine, alcohol, beer, champagne. Yet behind each term stood an industry that had consumed her gift without pause. She was celebrated, crowned the voice of a century, but too rarely did anyone stop to ask whether she could still carry the weight. That hotel bathroom did more than mark the end of a career. It ignited an ongoing reckoning about isolation at the height of success, about the relentless price of the spotlight, and about how pills, drinks, and inhaled escapes became a quiet, merciless companion within the world of R&B. The door clicked shut, and the last traces of an argument lingered in the hallway like a bad echo. Then everything went quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet, but the heavy kind, the kind that makes a house feel too small for the air inside it. Minutes later, that silence would be broken by a single, irreversible sound, and nothing Marvin Gaye ever recorded, no plea for love, no call for peace, could soften what came next. By the time news reached the public, the story was already being reduced to a headline-sized tragedy: a fatal gunshot, a family home, a legend gone at 44. The official cause was not complicated on paper: a wound, a death, a conclusion. And yet, from the beginning, what haunted people was not the clarity of the ending, but the feeling that the days leading up to it were a maze, full of stress, tension, and a life that seemed to be tightening around him. People who followed Marvin's career knew the contrast was almost unbearable. Here was a man whose music was built on intimacy, on confession, on longing, on the desire to mend what was broken. He sang about connection as if it were oxygen, but the environment around him in those final days, according to accounts that have circulated over the years, was defined by conflict, volatility, and the kind of domestic pressure that doesn't announce itself until it has already done damage. Those close to the situation have described a period when his world felt unstable. Financial strain, personal exhaustion, and family relationships stretched past their limit. The picture that emerges is not of one dramatic moment appearing out of nowhere, but of a slow erosion, sleepless nights, repeated arguments, and the emotional grind of living under constant friction. When the tragedy occurred, it was framed as a sudden catastrophe, but for many, it looked like the end of something that had been building quietly for a long time. What makes Marvin's story so unsettling is that it leaves people staring into the gap between what he gave the world and what he lived in private. He asked what's going on and became a voice for compassion and clarity. But his final chapter seemed to unfold in a space where clarity was scarce, and where the people closest to him were caught in a situation that spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it. Look at the images from near the end of his life, and you can feel why the public still wrestles with it. The gaze seems farther away. The face looks more tired than the version of him etched into the golden years. And the tragedy forces an uncomfortable question. How does a person who once felt larger than life become so vulnerable inside a single house, inside a single family, inside a conflict that turns fatal? Even now, decades later, people return to the headlines and feel that same constriction in the chest, not because the cause of death is unclear, but because the human story around it feels unresolved. It's the kind of loss that makes fans search for meaning in fragments, interviews, Timelines, recollections, any detail that might explain whether there were chances to intervene. Moments where someone could have slowed the momentum, asked the right question, or simply listened long enough for the pressure to ease. And that's why his music carries a double weight today. When Let's Get It On plays, it's still magnetic. When Sexual Healing comes on, the voice still pulls the room toward him. But beneath the smoothness, people hear the ghost of what didn't heal, of a man whose art promised closeness, yet whose life ended inside a storm he couldn't sing his way out of. The paperwork may close a case with a clean conclusion, but legends don't disappear cleanly. They leave behind echoes of brilliance, of struggle, and of questions that keep returning every time the needle drops. The stage lights are long gone, but in the minds of many fans, Teddy Pendergrass is still standing at the microphone, voice steady, heat in every note, the kind of soul that could make an arena feel intimate. His legacy remains carved into R&B history, warm, commanding, and unmistakably human. And then came 1982, the year a single accident split his story in two. The man who once moved across stages with electric confidence would spend the rest of his life navigating a different reality, one measured not in tours and ovations, but in endurance. By the time he passed in 2010, grief arrived with a second, sharper edge. Uncertainty, not about what he meant to music, but about what his body had been forced to endure in silence. In the years since, whispers have circulated, suggestions of complications, infections, and physical suffering that never quite made it into the public narrative in full. Some people who claimed proximity to his world hinted that the hardest battles were not only about paralysis, but about the long tail of medical vulnerability that can follow catastrophic injury. And that is where the story tightens into something more tense than tragedy alone. The absence of clarity, no widely accepted, detailed account ever settled the matter for the public. The result is a familiar pattern in celebrity loss, an information vacuum where rumor rushes in to take the place of facts. Fans, wanting to make sense of what happened, end up reading between lines that may not exist, searching for certainty in secondhand fragments. The contradiction at the heart of Teddy's legacy is stark. On one side, the image of an artist at the peak of his power, magnetic, defiant, alive with purpose. On the other, the private reality of a body living with profound limitations and the medical complications that can accompany long-term immobility. People can accept misfortune. What they struggle to accept is silence. Silence that can feel like concealment, even when it is simply the byproduct of privacy, family protection, or fragmented reporting. That tension becomes even heavier when fans place his story inside a broader cultural context. For many Black artists of his era, the spotlight was never purely glamorous. It was hard-won, often lived under pressure, and frequently accompanied by a public appetite for inspiration without the discomfort of the full human cost. When details are scarce, people start asking questions that are as much about society as they are about one man. Was the narrative simplified to preserve an icon? Was it driven by a media machine that prefers neat endings over complicated suffering? Or did something deeper shape what was amplified and what was minimized? The coldest part, in the end, is not death itself. It is the long, unresolved quiet that followed. The audience is left holding two truths at once: admiration for the voice and unease about the unanswered questions. Those who knew him may carry their own memories, brief glimpses, partial conversations, impressions of decline or resilience, but to the public, such accounts remain unverified fragments. And ambiguity, when attached to grief, becomes its own kind of torment. So Teddy Pendergrass lives on as more than a great singer. He becomes a symbol of a harsh duality, the brilliance of performance and the private weight that fame cannot lift. When his name is spoken, people still hear the music, but they also hear the silence around the harder parts of the story. And sometimes, it is precisely those empty spaces, those missing details, that make a legacy feel even more haunting, because the questions keep echoing long after the final note fades. People like to believe that a legendary voice outlives everything: time, suffering, even the body that carried it. But sometimes the opposite happens. The voice becomes immortal, and the body becomes a battleground long after the final note. In the case of Etta James, That collision between reverence and scrutiny turned her last chapter into something that felt heavier than music. When she died in 2012, the public did what it always does with icons. It searched for a clean ending, a dignified goodbye, a final scene of peace after a long illness. But the conversation didn't stay gentle for long. Reports and commentary about strong medications, about pain management at the end of life, began to swirl, and suddenly the story shifted from mourning to interrogation. It was no longer just, she suffered, and then she passed. It became, what exactly happened behind the curtain? Etta James had never been a fragile symbol. Her name was built on grit, on a voice that sounded like it had lived through storms and still dared to sing about love. In her later years, she faced serious health challenges, and those closest to her described a difficult medical reality, significant pain, decline, and the complicated care that often comes with serious illness. In that context, medication is not a scandal, it is often a necessity. But once the public hears words like cocktail, the tone changes. The same treatment that can represent compassion in a hospital room can look like something sinister when framed as a headline. That is where the tragedy sharpens, because the argument was never only about pills. It was about meaning, what the medication signified to people who needed their hero's ending to feel safe. Some fans wanted to believe she was kept comfortable, protected from agony, allowed a quiet exit after months of suffering. Others, fed by fragmentary claims and secondhand chatter, began to suspect excess, negligence, even intent. And in between those camps sat the most difficult truth. The public rarely sees enough to judge, but it almost always tries anyway. Family statements and public denials, when they appeared, did not calm everyone. To some, they sounded like reassurance. To others, they sounded like control, another layer of secrecy around a black woman whose life had already been shaped by hardship, judgment, and unequal treatment. Whether or not those suspicions were fair, the emotional logic behind them was familiar. When information is incomplete, people fill gaps with fear. When official detail is scarce, rumor becomes loud. And Etta's identity made the whole debate feel sharper. In black music history, she represented defiance, an artist who fought through prejudice and a brutal past to become undeniable. So the idea that her final story might be reduced to whispers about medication felt like a cruel inversion, not because pain relief is shameful, but because the public often turns private suffering into spectacle, especially when the subject is a black icon, and the world feels entitled to an explanation it was never promised. Perhaps the most painful detail is this. Etta James spent her life singing about love, messy love, aching love, love that doesn't behave. Yet in her final phase, the emotion surrounding her name was not tenderness. It was suspicion. People asked questions that sounded like moral judgments disguised as concern. Was she truly comforted? Was her care appropriate? Did something cross a line no one wants to name? Without a single, widely accepted narrative to settle the matter, her legacy became a stage for argument, an ending written not in harmony, but in doubt. And that is the quiet cruelty that follows certain legends. When the lights go out, their bodies don't simply return to privacy. They become evidence. They become symbols. A medical process meant to document reality can turn into a cultural mirror, reflecting not only physical suffering, but the way society handles pain, fame, and race. For Etta James, it meant that even after a lifetime of giving the world songs about love, the world answered her final chapter with a chorus of questions, unresolved, uneasy, and impossible to fully silence. Luther Vandross was once the kind of name that could hush a room. In R&B, his voice didn't merely sing, it persuaded. Every melody carried a softness that felt almost unreal, as if tenderness itself had learned to speak. So when he died in 2005 from complications after a stroke, the public instinctively reached for closure. Another legend gone, another chorus of tributes, another farewell written in headlines. But closure didn't last. Before long, speculation began to drift through the spaces where fans gather. Quiet talk that the medical truth might have been harsher than the public ever heard. The idea that an autopsy could reveal deeper damage, especially to his heart, turned grief into something unsettled. In an instant, the story shifted from mourning to wondering, from loss to lingering doubt. The entertainment world has never been gentle with the people it crowns. Behind the velvet sound of Luther's ballads was a career lived under constant demand. Sessions, tours, deadlines, expectations, plus the silent pressure to look right, to appear controlled, to stay flawless. Over the years, commentators and publications have linked the grind of that lifestyle, along with extreme attempts at physical transformation, to the way the body can weaken under sustained stress. The audience sees the spotlight. They rarely see the discipline and sacrifice that happen off stage, where the body pays for perfection in private. And then there was the family's response: restraint. No dramatic rebuttals, no detailed disclosures, no public confirmation of the chatter. Perhaps it was an effort to protect his dignity, to keep his final chapter from being pulled apart for spectacle. Yet in the strange economy of celebrity, silence often has a side effect. It amplifies the very noise it tries to avoid. The less that was said, the more people filled the gaps with theories, and the more the gaps widened, the more his death took on the shape of a mystery fans couldn't stop circling. There's a cruel symbolism at the center of it all. Luther's heart, metaphorically, gave people some of the most romantic, aching songs in modern R&B. His voice made listeners believe that love could be careful, sincere, and lasting. Yet in this story, the heart becomes something else too. The place where unspoken strain might have gathered, where burdens no one saw could have accumulated. The weight of stardom, the isolation that can exist even at the top, the pressure to keep delivering comfort while quietly running out of it yourself. Those forces don't show up on a stage, but they can live inside a body for years. That's the tragedy fans keep returning to. Luther was held up as proof that gentleness could survive in a hard world. But the speculation surrounding his medical story suggests a harsher lesson. Admiration doesn't prevent decline, and fame doesn't remove invisible pressure. It sometimes multiplies it. When the family kept the details private, devoted listeners were left balancing two realities: the official account on paper, and the uneasy thought that the private truth might have been more painful than anyone wanted to admit. Maybe that is why Luther Vandross still feels close to people. Not only because the songs endure, but because the unanswered parts of the story do too. He sang as if love could heal anything, yet he left behind a silence that invites the same question again and again. What was happening inside that heart? And why did the full story never become something the public could finally understand? James Brown never moved like an ordinary man. So it almost feels inevitable that his final chapter refused to sit neatly inside a single explanation. When he died in 2006, people expected what they always expect after a famous death: a straightforward medical conclusion, a document that draws a clean line under the story of a legend. Instead, what followed was something far messier: partial accounts, restricted details, and a lingering haze that has fed questions for years. Not long after, reports began circulating that medical findings referenced issues related to his cardiovascular system, along with signs of respiratory illness and medications associated with treating it. But the public never received a complete, widely accepted picture. The information that did surface felt incomplete, enough to suggest a complicated medical reality, yet not enough to settle anything definitively. In the space between known and not fully disclosed, speculation took root. Among those who claimed closeness to Brown's final period, a particular concern kept reappearing in conversation: whether his care had been mishandled. The allegation, repeated in different forms over time, was that treatment decisions shifted rapidly and that strong medications were administered under urgent conditions. These accounts were not presented with one authoritative, transparent record that the public could evaluate. They floated instead as fragments, assertions that, if true, would mean the last days of the Godfather of Soul unfolded amid confusion rather than control. And then there was the silence around documentation. Whether due to privacy, legal complexity, or other constraints, parts of the record were described as sealed or not readily accessible. For fans, that silence didn't feel neutral. It felt like being kept at arm's length from the truth about someone they had spent decades celebrating. When details are scarce, people rarely sit patiently with uncertainty. They start building explanations. Some are plausible, some are extreme, and over time, the absence of clarity becomes its own story, one that conspiracy thinking is all too ready to inhabit. That tension only sharpened the contradiction that defined James Brown in life. He was a figure of fierce discipline and raw vulnerability, revered for reshaping music and yet never far from chaos, controversy, and hard edges. His death did not simplify that paradox. It amplified it. People asked why someone of his stature seemed to leave behind so many unanswered questions. Why a process designed to illuminate medical documentation, post-death evaluation, ended up feeling to many like another curtain being drawn. Those who defended him insisted he had earned transparency, a man who gave everything to performance, who turned his body into an instrument, who electrified crowds with a voice that demanded attention. Yet the public narrative that followed his passing remained scattered. News clippings, secondhand recollections, arguments about what could be proven versus what could only be suspected. And in that fragmentation, doubt persisted. There is a particular cruelty in the contrast. James Brown built a career on command, on refusing to be ignored. He famously insisted on being heard. But the story of his final days, at least as the public encountered it, ended up wrapped in something he spent his life fighting against. Silence. Not the silence after a song ends, but the silence of missing pages and restricted details, where questions keep circling and answers never quite arrive. Maybe that is the lasting sting. A life lived at maximum volume, an artist who pushed culture forward, yet an ending many feel remains partly obscured. And so, even now, his name carries two legacies at once: the undeniable impact of the godfather of soul, and the unresolved ache of a story that still feels unfinished, because in the absence of full clarity, the world keeps listening for a truth it cannot quite reach. The knock on the hospital door wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The news it carried was enough to ripple through a whole community of listeners who had been holding their breath. Gerald Levert, whose voice could make a late night feel like home, was suddenly gone, leaving songs unfinished and fans stranded in disbelief. When the medical finding was reported, it didn't read like a sensational twist so much as a bleak explanation. Acute intoxication, an overload produced not by one single substance, but by a combination of medications that, taken together, became dangerously powerful. The kind of ending that stuns people precisely because it doesn't look outrageous on the surface. It looks ordinary, familiar, like something that could happen quietly, without anyone realizing the line had been crossed. The names involved were the kind many people recognize from the vocabulary of pain and insomnia: prescription painkillers, anti-anxiety medication, even common cough medicine. Each item, in isolation, might not seem like the kind of thing that topples a healthy person. But bodies are not isolated systems, and neither are lives. Gerald wasn't a teenager with endless stamina anymore. He was an adult carrying the expectations that come with a legacy, an artist balancing career pressure, physical wear, and the exhausting responsibility of keeping the Levert name strong in public. Layered onto that was the kind of health strain that doesn't show up in stage lights. Breathing problems can turn rest into a struggle and sleep into a negotiation. Pain can make recovery feel impossible. And once a person is living in that cycle, tour schedules, long nights, constant demands, medication stops being a choice in the simple sense. It becomes routine, something to knock the pain down, something to calm the mind, something to keep going, something to make it through the next day. People who spoke about him afterward often emphasized that he wasn't chasing thrills. He was trying to endure. The grind of recording, travel, and performance, the quiet expectation to stay accessible, to stay strong, to always be for the people, can compress a life until there's no space left for real recovery. And what makes the story cut deeper is the absence of a single villain. No dramatic intent, no one clean moment to point to. Just a chain of small decisions, each one understandable, adding up to an irreversible outcome. Instead of ending the conversation, the medical conclusion sparked new questions. How did exhaustion become invisible to the people around him? How did medications meant to help blur the warning signs rather than reveal them? In an industry where applause is earned through sleeplessness, where every performance is paid for in private wear and tear, it forces an uncomfortable thought. How many artists are running on borrowed energy? One prescription at a time. Gerald Levert is still remembered as a rich, soulful voice, an artist who carried forward a family legacy with pride and power. But in that hospital room, When the language of the report replaced the language of music, the glory suddenly felt distant. What remained was something far more human, a man dealing with pain and fatigue, surrounded by substances that looked small and manageable, until they weren't. Tiny pills, ordinary labels, and a quiet storm that arrived without warning. The engines screamed once more before the Bahamian sky seemed to fold in on itself, a ribbon of smoke cutting across the orange glow of sunset. The aircraft was never meant to carry what it did, far heavier than regulations allowed, burdened by hundreds of extra pounds. Alia, with her calm gaze and a voice that defined the sound of the early 2000s, boarded that plane believing she was heading back to New York, back to a career that was only just reaching its full power. Instead, moments after liftoff, the journey collapsed into noise and terror, a violent blast, thick black smoke, and an instant that stunned the entire music world into silence. The medical examiner's findings offered no comfort, only precision stripped of emotion, severe burns, catastrophic head injuries, and a heart already vulnerable. No body could have survived that level of trauma. Even an immediate rescue would not have changed the outcome. What deepened the grief were the surrounding details. The pilot lacked proper certification for the aircraft. Toxicology tests later revealed alcohol and cocaine in his system, and the flight itself bore the marks of haste and poor judgment. There were later accounts suggesting hesitation. Some witnesses recalled that Alia questioned the load, noticing how much equipment had been packed, even weighing the idea of delaying departure. But deadlines pressed in. People were waiting. An industry machine was already moving, and stopping it felt impossible. The decision tilted toward leaving immediately, a familiar pattern for young artists caught between caution and expectation. For her, that choice marked the end. As investigations unfolded, the tragedy appeared less like an accident and more like a sequence of preventable failures. An unqualified pilot, an overloaded aircraft, stimulants in the cockpit, a schedule that refused to bend. Each element alone might have raised alarms. Together, they formed a fatal chain. In the aftermath, headlines described Alia not only as a victim of a crash, but as someone undone by rushed decisions she did not fully control. The pain for fans went beyond losing the voice behind songs like Rock the Boat and Try Again. It carried a sharp sense of unfairness. At just 22, she stood on the edge of becoming a defining figure for a new generation. Her life ended not through illness or time, but because of calculations on a scale and choices that might have been avoided. The language of the autopsy, terms like shock and cardiac weakness, landed as a brutal reminder that fame offers no protection from recklessness. Today, when her image flickers across screens, people remember more than her soft smile framed by dark hair. They remember the sound of an engine pushed too hard, the sky lit by fire, and a plane that never reached its destination. That crash did more than steal a rising star. It shattered the belief that safety would always come first in an industry built on speed, pressure, and spectacle. Music lifts us higher than ordinary life ever can. But behind the spotlight, there is another reality. Bodies pushed past their limits, hearts worn thin, and medical records that sometimes raise more questions than they answer. These artists leave us more than unforgettable songs. They leave unfinished conversations, fragments, rumors, restricted details, and gaps that never fully close, no matter how many years pass. And maybe that's what unsettles people most. Not simply that they're gone, but that the truth feels just out of reach, locked behind paperwork, privacy, and time. Yet those uncertainties also change the way we hear the music. The records don't only carry joy, they carry strain. They don't only shine, they shadow. And somehow, that tension makes the art feel even more human, more alive. So let's keep their names present in more than playlists. Keep the stories moving, keep the questions honest, and keep the memory respectful. If this piece resonated with you, support the channel, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. We'll keep tracing the stories behind the legends, one chapter at a time.